Good morning, R. Michael Fisher. I wanted to talk a little bit about this book I'm working on right now, the Marianne Williamson phenomenon, Cultural Revolution in a Dangerous Time. This will be published probably later this year, particularly before the November election in America. I'll read a few pages from that book. That's from chapter 6. It's a rough draft, but give you a sense of what I'm concerned about and why I've devoted, almost 2 years to writing this book. I followed Marianne Williamson, which you can look up on Wikipedia. You can look up anywhere on the internet. She's a very well-known leader and sometimes thought to be a leader in the spiritual, New Age, human potential wellness, and also, more importantly, she has combined spirituality with a political leadership, really, that started back in the 90s. And that is something you'll hear referred to in the couple pages I'm going to read today. I know reading and listening on the internet is maybe not the most exciting thing, especially if you don't have a lot of visuals, which I don't. I hardly know how to edit or do much on this machine. But I appreciate the Zoom for the possibility of creating videos from my YouTube channel. I've done several interviews of myself and my work and my research reflecting on the Marianne Williamson phenomenon, her leadership running for the 2020 campaign, particularly for a Democratic hopeful for the presidency of the United States of America. And wow, did I think that could be really something if she would have even got close to or even got into the final election, which she hasn't, as you probably know, or if you don't know, she dropped out of the campaign run for president in 2020. She dropped out in just, I think, around January 10th. Lack of votes in the primaries, she was predicting she wouldn't do very well, and lack of funding, i.e. lack of supporters who did not show up over her really hard fought and well-deserved campaign that she put a ton of energy and passion into, with the highest ideals, of which I am excited about many of those ideals, even though as you'll hear my chapter, this particular one I'm going to read today is from the section of the book. So just to be clear, I have 3 sections in the book coming out. The first section is really more the phenomenon, and that looks at the phenomenon of Marianne Williamson, the phenomenon of the presidential election coming up, and Donald Trump as another phenomenon. So that's what I cover in the first part of the book, and the interesting mirroring between Donald Trump and Marianne Williamson, which I think is intriguing on many levels. They're very different and they're very similar, to be blunt. The second part of the book is my critical analysis, so I kind of really dive in after I do, a very significant amount of appreciations and showing the importance of this kind of new leader, which I'm very interested in, what I call the fearless leader. What will a fearless leader look like in the new world coming, if one ever appears again? We don't know. And what does fearless mean? I explore that in the book too. But the second part of the book is the more critical turn, and this chapter is of that ilk. Then the last part of the book is the lessons. And this chapter as well also has the lessons that can be learned. That's why I did the book. I mean, I'm not out to criticize and put down Marianne Williamson or any leader. I'm here to help discern what is going to make a great leader for our time, and what probably is the mistakes they're going to make, and let's learn from those mistakes. Big deal. Okay, so people make mistakes, even great leaders, but we do need a new kind of leader. We do need new kind of leaders and communities and supportive groups that support those leaders rather than tearing them down. I've always believed in that. I'm not somebody who says everything should be, revolutionary from the ground up. And you'll notice cultural revolution, evolution is the subtitle of this book, as I showed earlier. That I'm not just a supporter of top-down leadership or bottom-up leadership. It's not an either-or. I'm pretty convinced, my study of history, my own life experience, and been a leader myself in my own small ways, that it requires cooperation in both, and it requires an immense communication between the upper and the lower, and the people who actually deserve to lead, and people who deserve to be respected when they follow. Let me start with the introduction to the book. Just before I start into chapter 6, which I'll read 3 pages from. And in this introduction, I start with a quote, and that's all I'm going to read from the introduction. It's a quote from one of her fans in this 2020 campaign. Marianne Williamson is fearless and will speak the truth about this government, about our country, about our children, and about what other candidates are afraid to address. It is time for a president who sees the country for what we are, and Mrs. Williamson gets it. Ms. Williamson gets it. The people matter. We, the people. Chapter 6. Kind of an odd, perhaps intriguing title, hopefully, that will attract readers. She is missing the right 6 words. Quote from Marianne Williamson, there's 3 of them that I start with. Give you a feel of where I'm going and how I'm listening to Marianne Williamson in a particular interpretive way, both as a social scientist type educator researcher myself. Okay, here we go, Marianne Williamson. Just as it's been said that war is far too serious a topic to be left in the hands of generals, the future of our country is far too serious to be left in the hands of traditional politicians. What we most need now is a political visionary. I hope you will find my campaign to be something that ups your own experience of citizenship, not only for the purposes of electing me president, but for the sake of forging a new chapter in our history. Only seriously radical truth-telling is going to be deep enough to defeat big lies. And all 3 of those quotes, controversial as they are said with great passion, as only Marianne Williamson can deliver. I cannot even come close to doing her justice and the words and what they mean. Now to my own voice. In a recent interview, Williamson made no bones about her critical position on politicians in general, and specifically regarding her Democratic running mates for president. They pander audiences too much, she says, quote, "Today we have a politics of people-pleasing," end quote. "And this is not my way. True leaders with attendant moral courage say what needs to be said because it's right to do so, because they want to be, so they do so because they want to be popular. Her truthing mission is to set a new moral course for the country, one not based on President Trump's reality show approach to leadership, but as she says, I am showing reality," end quote, to the people. Cute little twist of phrase there on her part. I like the contrast Williamson creates, yet I wonder if most voters are strong enough to take it and will rather prefer the former and fear more the latter. Most basically, America is a death-phobic culture, as some critics have remarked, and it is necessarily dying as an empire before it can be reborn in a healthy or revolution. Williamson believes, unlike near every politician and her Democratic running mates in 2020, Williamson seems to ignore Nietzsche's 19th century cautionary regarding truth, which is still apt for our times, quoting Nietzsche. The strength of a person's, could put nations, spirit is measured by how much truth he could tolerate, or more precisely, to what extent he needs to have it diluted, disguised, sweetened, muted, falsified. End of quote. Turn my heater off. Vividly angry and righteous at times, she emphasizes the whole truth is more important than pleasing people with partial and muted truths. In her view, it is flagrantly disrespectful and infantilizing to treat citizens like children that supposedly can't handle the truth. She uses the analogy that if she goes to the doctor and they have a diagnosis of serious cancer, she wants the whole truth, not a doctor to treat her as if she cannot handle it. She abhors the thought that they might leave out critical medical information for her based on fear. Her political philosophy thus amounts to a relatively radical stance for any leader, never mind a politician, and a presidential hopeful to make it to the top. In the latter case, one could say her approach is bad marketing for a politician, yet perhaps it works for a political visionary. Time will tell. Williamson's from the heart and hip truthing has something to do with her aging. As she said, hitting 64 her first time, quote, "It's the age past where you gotta say it. There's something that needs to be said in this country," end quote. Her most ardent and or newly won fans have loved her speaking the truth. As one 71-year-old counseling psychologist remarked, quote, "She wants to change people's hearts first, so that any laws enacted reflect the consensual will of the people," end quote. No matter what position, that is left, right, or center, we all have some kernel of truth. And that's the democracy Williamson stands for. This psychologist also recognized, quote, "Marianne is not making a pitch to Democrats. She's having a deeper conversation," end quote. While another critical commentator said, quote, "She doesn't sound or carry herself like a politician," end quote. Another called her, quote, "a fish out of water," end quote. Attempting to distinguish two political universes, her term, in opposition, standing above the fray of one universe of personalities in politics and taking the second higher road, at times one hears her loathing of contemporary politics. And she spoke to an audience in Warner, New Hampshire, quote, "Here we were in one place, in our hearts, as opposed to a gazillion shattered pieces of glass of personality, which is what politics has become. We're doing it differently, not from the opposition and the shouting and the chaos and the power and the money. It doesn't matter what the DNC says. It matters what you say." DNC being the Democratic National Congress. Start the next paragraph. Quote, I will get behind whoever the Democrat is. I am a Democrat. I'm not going to badmouth them," end quote, she said to one reporter. That maybe was her intention, but evidence showed as the campaign progressed, she was badmouthing them. During the 2020 campaign run, ambivalence in her words and actions left plenty room for critics. Some critics, perhaps many voters, also wondered if she really wanted to be a politician at all, or merely wanted to improve her business profile and or religious doctrine, even if she speaks from the heart. She said in regard to her over 60s truthing mission, quote, "After all, there's no platform like a presidential campaign," end quote, to get one's voice out there. Her voice seems to have ended up too fat for politics, where donations and votes count. Obviously, she's not your average politician or Democrat, even though her Wikipedia page says, quote, "Marianne Deborah Williamson is an American author, spiritual leader, politician, and activist, end quote. What desired outcome as a potential candidate does she really want? She's clear she wants a Democrat victory. That's uncontroversial. She repeats in speeches and interviews she would not want to take 10 votes away from another Democrat stronger leader in the end. However, a lingering skepticism grows as I watch her daily in the media. There is something she is doing which is less than upfront and straightforward. Perhaps it's even unconscious. What is her real identity and mission in the political race? As I have pointed out in chapters 2 to 4, there are growing concerns from many diverse quarters about this same issue. For example, she doesn't hesitate in public to harshly critique the Democratic National Congress, DNC, and her Democratic partners, almost coming off as superior in her stance, as she truly believes she is the only one that can beat Donald Trump in the next year. At times, she seems driven by her absolute higher principles, overriding the more strategic political pragmatics of actually winning the office. When Jonathan Capehart in September 29 asked her in an interview what she has learned in the campaign so far and how it may be applicable to the presidential job itself, Williamson slowed her body, looked up, and reflected, quote, "It's a job audition," end quote. And like all auditions and interviews, it is anxiety-provoking and exhausting because this process is so long and every day for over a year, as I paraphrased her just there. Later, as the campaign went on, her tone shifted overtly, and harsh words towards the faux democracy, her word, of the old boys in the back room of the DNC aroused her sentiments on the more sarcastic side of her views about her employers within the Democratic Party team she was supporting and wishing to lead. With more flack accruing from the left and fellow Democrats, she said with some bitterness, quote, "It's like you have to audition to be a Democrat these days," end quote, eyes turning. She was already showing some tiredness in the autumn, and by January 2020, enough was enough and she dropped out of the race. The great awakening she envisioned didn't manifest. Maybe it was in large part due to a misfit, because as she said in October 19, quote, "Politics should be sacred," quote. That's a quote from Mahatma Gandhi, one of her favorite idol political leaders of all time. And currently, politics is, in her words, quote, "the opposite of sacred," end quote. I have to say, I wonder who she thinks she is talking to with such claims. What universe is she living in? Is this good and effective leadership? There's no doubt it must be trying to be on, totally aware, totally together, 24/7 as a public celebrity. Never mind a hopeful presidential candidate in America these days. Her high ideals apparently do keep her flying high. That's the energy swirl she is near addicted to. Yet something more is going on. Beyond the energetic grand performance she is so comfortable with on stage, I return to her admission that it is in fact a, quote, "job audition," end quote, she has undertaken, like it or not. My investigation in this chapter 6 proceeds on that basis, while asking critically if she really takes in the pragmatic contextual reality of a job interview orientation for shaping her public behaviors, her attitudes, and her preaching upon the campaign stage. I present a case that points to her shooting herself in the foot more than once in how she approaches the grand interview for president of the United States, an interview conducted by those with the sole power of decision on the other side of the table, both the DNC and the voting public of America. First, let me offer some germane background before my argument. She knows the seriousness of the job. During the 2020 campaign, characteristically, Williamson thought and spoke with firebrand optimism and well ahead of the curve, while she thought sincerely was for the benefit of all Americans. At one point on the election trail, she made this thoughtfulness evident, according to a reporter, quote, "In choosing a VP running mate, she would want to choose someone who she would trust would be able to continue doing the job of president should she die early," end of quote. Apparently she actually talked about that. I find this courageous, while also consistent with her prescient forward thought, probably and unfortunately a few decades before her time. Nonetheless, being unpopular at times deters her not from taking risks and expanding futurist and visionary ventures, something I quite like about her. For example, the wording of the controversial title of her pivotal political and spiritual book, here's where she really took a risk, in my opinion, Healing the Soul of America, in 2000. That book came out 3 years earlier, The Healing of America, and she added soul into the title by 2000 with the publisher's permission, and again, was not a best-selling book. This brought her a wave of criticism and significant drop in book sales relative to her former New York Times bestsellers prior. As one acerbic book reviewer commented on her book, Healing of the Soul of America in 2000, "It's nothing but a bludgeoning of readers with grandiose good intentions. This exuberant exhortation by Williamson to return to America's founding principles gives the sensation of being assaulted by a college roommate in the throes of a late-night epiphany," end quote. Okay, I didn't get in that chapter yet in this reading and to the 6 words that she's missing, and I'll leave that as a bit of a secret for when the book comes out. You can perhaps check that out. In closing here, speaking both to Marianne Williamson and to her fans and to her critics, as I've said all along in my other talks on my YouTube channel and several publications now starting to come out that I'm writing about Marianne Williamson as a very important historical figure. So whatever you think of her personality, well, I focus on this book, on the phenomenon that she's creating as really a catalyst for both, the best and the worst at times of, like the critics who just finished, summarizing the purpose of her book or the value of her book, which this person thought was not very valuable. But one has to say, as someone who is interested in the cultural therapy of our times, the cultural healing of our times, yes, I'm all for the basic thrust of what Marianne Williamson brings forward as a leader who I call in the near path, the near dimension of fearlessness. Thanks very much for this today. Good day.